Well, hello, everybody. It's 6 p.m., and welcome to the Black Men Speak podcast live stream. I am your host, Keith Dent, and you are in for a treat tonight. I'm not going to give it up just yet, um, but if you have been following the show, you already know who our guest is going to be. But before we get started with that, I'm going to read an excerpt from his book that really gives a definite impact on what it is about. Oh, before I get into that, yes, what is the Black Men Speak about? Black Men Speak is a podcast live stream that gives Black men a chance to be heard, feel empowered, and be the men that they're called to be. And this is really a great opportunity. And so now I'm going to read this excerpt. Tokens develop a segment of society that is unconstrained by the markets of second-class citizenship. We are sheltered from the overt manifestations of structural racism. The most unjust elements that largely define the Black plight are foreign to us. Thus, we are saved the burden of confronting our difference. Our environment is one of opportunity, and we are molded into both products and pursuers of that opportunity. Our aspirations in youth are constrained by our imagination alone, and these imaginations float freely over long stares from parents and around attitude-inspired suspension. The reveal occurs only when these fanciful ideals collide head-on with the jarring reality beyond the veil that privilege has erected. A reality that our counterparts in less forgiving environments have been socialized into since birth. That's hard hitting. That is an excerpt from our guest tonight. And Cole Brown, and he's the author of this book. You can see it here, Greyboy. He was raised in the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. Cole Brown is a Philly kid at heart. While spending childhood summers between Ethiopia and the Midwest, Cole matured in Philadelphia's predominantly white private schools and neighborhoods, an experience that delivered an awareness of race and class from a young age. After graduating high school, Cole moved to Washington, D.C. to attend Georgetown University as a finance major. Of course, anyone that's watched the show knows that's my alma mater too, so I'm excited about that. But landmark events such as the death of Michael Brown and the election of Donald Trump caused Cole to rethink his original plans. Cole graduated from Georgetown with a major in justice and peace studies and a passion for storytelling. During his time at Georgetown, was inspired to begin penning this book, and the working title, or the title, full title, is Greyboy: Finding Blackness in a White World. So Cole, hey, how you doing?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, yes.
There we go. It's good to be here, Keith. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you. I'm glad you're on tonight. And I can't wait to talk about this book. I actually read it twice. Shout out to my man,
Wow.
Victor Nicholson, who is an avid reader. And he had it posted on his Facebook page. And I was like, Greyboy, that's an interesting book. And he was, and I'm gonna wait for you to tell me. But he's like, oh yeah, he's from Georgetown. And I looked into it. I was like, oh, I definitely have to read this book because, we, being the fact that I graduated in 1989, we had a different perspective of what Georgetown was about. And I can't wait to get in that a little bit. But for those who haven't read Greyboy, just give us a kind of a brief synopsis of what it's about.
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. I think that you got at it a bit in that excerpt you just read. Greyboy is part memoir. It's largely my story, but it's also the stories of several others that I interviewed as well. And the thing that we have in common is that we are Black kids that grew up in white spaces, privileged white spaces often. And it's about that experience. It's about growing up in an environment of dissimilarity and how that impacts your sense of identity. And traveling towards that sense of identity through adolescence and then eventually from the early college years. So it charts my path towards hopefully finding an affirmed Black identity and the ways in which the world might have told me something different about myself over the years.
Great. Yeah. Awesome. And so I know you touched upon the fact that it was your teenage years, and just for
Mhm.
probably most of us, just that alone can be jarring, and we all can have stories to tell. But what
Yeah.
made you feel compelled to want to put it in a kind of a book form as opposed to just keeping it in your journal?
Yeah, so you've already brought up Georgetown, our shared alma mater. I think that was record time. I don't think it took more than 30 seconds into the conversation for Georgetown to come up, which is
Yeah.
rightfully so. I'm a proud Hoya, and this started as an essay for a class at Georgetown. So I was in an entrepreneurship class actually, and the on the first day the professor told us that we would have to write a book on a business we wanted to start. His version of a book was really a very long essay. But when I heard just the word count of that very long essay, I immediately knew that this is the topic I wanted to dive into. I think I made up made up diversity business or something just so I could talk about this topic. This really was a story that I felt needed to be out there. I felt as though I hadn't seen myself reflected in much of storytelling in the past. So I wrote the essay for that class, and then basically didn't put it down and continued on for about 4 years until I had a full length book to share.
Okay. Wow. In 4 years, that's a long time. And
It's a
so
long time.
was it because of the fact that were and I'm sure you shared, your journey and what you were doing. Did you find that you needed more stories to tell, or were people telling you stories that you felt needed to be added into the book?
I think there's a couple factors that is the reason why it took so long. One is that I wasn't I didn't major in English or creative writing. I wasn't a storyteller. So some of that was just time that it took to learn how to write. That took a long time, frankly. Early drafts of the book were just not ready to be shared. So that was a lot of the years there. But then part of it is also that the book in some ways tracks that journey for me in real time. Had I rushed to publish it early, I would have missed much of the Trump years. I would have missed, some of the recent protests we had. I mean, there was key things that have happened in those years, both in my personal development, but also in the world, that I think the book needed to feel complete. So I think all of that time was actually necessary to get to the product that I ended up at.
Okay, yeah, and I'm gonna make sure I hold on to that thought, because I did, coming from a different perspective, where you were actually in the city at the time, and I was, I'm in New Jersey, and
Yeah.
being, with kids, our concern was, well, what's going to be the future for them? And I mean, we can ask it now, and you were in the thick of it, being in the city. So as a young black man, what were the, and just collectively also from being in this, what was the overall sense that you got, how people felt during that time period?
And you're talking about during the election of 2016.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was a junior at the time. I actually think I was in this class that we're talking about when that happened. And there's a chapter in the book, as you would have seen, the big reveal, which was entirely written during that week, and has been largely untouched in the years since. And the reason I kept it that way is because I wanted to keep the sense of just like mortal terror that people felt that week, that I think that 4 years of normalization of abnormal behavior has caused us to forget. And so that week I was terrified. And I think a lot of people on campus were terrified. I mean, people forget that, like, in DC, you could walk across campus and not hear a sound for 4 days. There was like grown men crying in the street. I mean, it was there was a real sense of endangerment that I think a lot of people felt. I was no different. I was terrified for my personal future, our collective future, the future of dear loved ones, both low income loved ones, my sister, and all of the many comments that had come out about his combative views of women. I mean, there were so many reasons to be concerned. I think many of those fears, frankly, had been confirmed over the past 4 years. But that first week was difficult.
Right. And then it really, And so was it weird to see actually those fears actually come to fruition right before the election when his minions kind of stormed the Capitol?
Yeah, right after the election, right before the inauguration. Yeah,
Right.
So I was at that time I was in Australia, and a lot had changed in the 4 years, both obviously in the country, but for me personally, at that time I was a political commentator in Australia and was speaking on the news pretty regularly. So, and because of the time difference, like we went to sleep in Australia and everything was normal. And then we woke up in Australia and there was a Viking on the Senate floor. Like there was no buildup. Like we didn't see we didn't see any of it. Literally I woke up and as you might imagine, my phone was just blowing up with images of all the terror that we saw. So, I mean, as a political commentator, that was a big work day. I had to get to work. But as an American, that was disturbing and so incredibly predictable. I mean, so foreseeable. And I think that was part of why it was so disturbing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's dive into the book a bit. I just wanted to get some of those housekeeping items out of the way.
Yes.
So one of the things I thought, which was fascinating, you talked about the black table. So I wanted to talk about this quote because I thought the way you phrased it is almost like there was a rite of passage you had to get to. So when guys at the black table told me I talked white, I was left without a life raft to hold on to. I was welcomed to the table the first day, but their respect and certainly their trust and affection were privileges I had to earn, and to do so, I'd have to keep up. So, what did you mean when you felt you had to keep up, and what changes did you have to make to do that?
So I think that a bit of context here might be necessary. So I grew up in a private schooling system. And felt at one uncomfortable with many of my white peers for much of the duration of my time in that private schooling system. But I think for a lot of kids, things began to change in middle school and early high school. That certainly was the case for me. And my race became a factor in those relationships. And I didn't feel as though I was really seen by many of my white peers any longer. So I think it was ninth grade when I decided to switch lunch tables to the black table. The black table is, both the literal table where all the black kids sat in the lunchroom. It's a well-known institution across private schools. And it was also all of us that sat around it. Like we were the black table. And when I made that move, I think I write in the book, people referred to it as coal going back to Africa. That's the kind of environment we were in.
Wow.
And I guess what I'm trying to get at in that quote is that there were cultural differences, as one might imagine. I mean, there were, this group, the group around the black table, had such stark differences to so many of our white peers and white counterparts. And I had grown up, frequenting the spaces with those white peers and white counterparts. I'd grown up, being with them at the country club and in their homes, and I no longer felt comfortable in that world as I once did. Here I was entering a new world with much different norms, and felt as though I wanted to be comfortable there, but I wasn't quite yet. Okay. I had to learn how to talk in a way that was familiar. I had to learn how to dress in a way that was familiar. I had to learn in a way, like so that we could sort of find common ground as well and build those relationships. Those are still to this day. Those are some of my brothers. Those are my closest friends on earth.
Right. And how long did it take you to actually feel like, oh, look, I'm comfortable here. These are my people.
Yeah. I think probably half a night, maybe a semester. But there was also, there's an element of like learning the rules of the road, but there was also an element of learning that it didn't really matter. There was also an element of getting there and being like, oh, wait a second, like it doesn't really matter whether I speak exactly like everybody else around the table.
Right.
There were much deeper things that we shared. I mean, really, and what really bonded us together was just a sense of loyalty, a sense of we had to be protective of each other because this world was not going to be. And that was much more significant than any sort of superficial quality.
Right. So that's interesting because when I was in high school, I actually had to go the opposite way. So I went to the black table and felt, comfortable there, because, my first girlfriend was black and we had moved. I didn't grow up in New Jersey. We had moved. And then there was an incident where I think it was called a nerd or something so then I no longer felt comfortable or felt like an outsider. So I had to gravitate to people that kind of just knew me for me. And so that was, and I think that was, so I found that very fascinating, the fact that you were able to do, you did that or felt because you had a sense that you weren't comfortable or things were changing. And then, when we got to Georgetown, the black table was the place to be, and it was a place of comfort and peace, and you felt you could just be yourself. So I thought that was.
I write about in the book that my sister and I, obviously raised as similarly as two human beings can be, took very different journeys in that regard. My sister never sat at the black table. She always, she stayed close with the girls that she had gone to kindergarten with all the way through. She still is to this day. I think both of those journeys are legitimate. You kind of got to find your own way in this world. I was not at the black table at Georgetown largely. I think that's okay. I don't think one should feel too pressured to do one way or another. It's just kind of the journey that I had.
Yeah, but I noticed, and I kind of just looked through just your pictures to get a sense of, the Georgia, because you didn't really talk about Georgetown as much in the book.
Right.
And so, but I got the sense that there was a piece of being able to just be you in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, at Georgetown, you were able to have whatever friends you were able to have, and it didn't really matter, which I thought was fascinating.
Because, in high school, I went to school, as we've discussed, in Philly, and it was so, I think I write this, it was so black and white. It was so, and the lines were so clearly drawn. I mean, this is where all of the black kids sat in one corner. And this is the kind, it was, so it was really difficult to try to do both. It was difficult to try to sort of fluidly cross those lines. At Georgetown, there was just more possibilities. And as a result, the society there kind of had to deal with mixed up people a bit more. I mean, there was the Middle Eastern kids, and there was the South American kids, and so much international influence, and there wasn't really a role for, in high school, there wasn't a role for a black kid that had come from the same prep schools as any of the white kids. And I think, though, as a result of that, I and a couple others I knew were granted the privilege of being able to kind of cross cliques and lines pretty fluidly. And as a result, I have a friend group that is largely black, but also largely everything else as well. And I feel privileged to have that.
And did it, and of course I didn't think we'd go this way, but in the effect, did it affect the overall relationships as a black group as a whole? Because we've kind of talked about, that in our group, we were very well connected. We were very close. We knew everybody. I'm almost to the fact that we couldn't date within Georgetown because everybody would be in your business, so to speak. And so and it was more of a family. But did you get that sense that collectively as a black group you were connected?
I know that existed. I mean, Black Georgetown existed. Hoya Blacksa, the Black House, which is, for those listening, is a literal building where black people congregate at Georgetown. So that world certainly existed. I felt as though I had that in high school. That was my group. That was sort of us against the world. At Georgetown, I think there was at times pressure to sort of commit yourself to that social scene. I didn't. I mean, many of my friends did, and I'm close with them. And I was granted again, I think because perhaps we were a bit older, it wasn't like sort of you're with us or you're not. Like I was granted the ability to enter that space and exit that space, and I could do both. And so I felt comfortable that way.
Yeah, which is very freeing to do. You know,
exactly, absolutely.
You can just focus on school and just be and just.
Well,
be.
I don't know that I did that, but one could. Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so in the chapter of bad, not good, you mentioned that you went from just being Ben's, which was your best friend, Ben's best friend, to Ben's black best friend. Yeah. So, which I thought was, and you didn't mention, but how did Ben actually react to that kind of statement and that there was actually a designation that now you'd been given?
Yeah, Ben, as you mentioned, was my best friend since we were 4 years old. White guy that grew up down the road from me. Still is to this day. I was just talking to him earlier today, and I don't know that he noticed it in the moment. I certainly did. I mean, we got to about seventh grade. I think it was in part the influence of all of a sudden we become aware of the fact that there is another sex, and like they're watching, you know, like all of a sudden everybody's really acutely attuned to what girls think of us and who likes who and so forth. And it was right around the seventh grade when, again, like I began being labeled Ben's best black friend. In the moment, I don't think he had I mean, that's difficult to expect of a seventh grade kid to have the wherewithal and empathy to understand that. We've had explicit conversations about it in the years since. And he absolutely sees that. And I think very much to his credit identifies how difficult it must have been to be the only black kid in an exclusively white at that time friend group.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and that's just a testament of who he is, the fact that he's
absolutely
able to, you know, definitely see that and to have empathy towards that, because, you know, if you grew up in the same area, so you can kind of surmise that he also was of privilege and therefore, you know, could have been just like, well, you know, too bad, you know, that's just how it goes. But the fact that he was a kind of a ride or die dude is pretty cool. Yeah. You know,
absolutely. Which is why we're close to this day.
Yeah. So, so you talked about, you know, and there was a part of, in the book, which I didn't, you know, touch upon a lot, but, and I heard you talked about is the, you know, the kind of the mental illness that you had as a result of some of the things that you went to. And then, so your mom had actually wrote you a letter. And so, and one of the things she mentioned was that she was deeply sorry that they missed, and I'm thinking your parent missed the minor signs for months until they became unavoidable. And so how did you feel that your mom actually had an idea that you were kind of suffering, but didn't act on it right away?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that I feel deeply for my mother after having read that chapter. For context, there's a chapter where I talk pretty explicitly about having made attempts on my own life. You mentioned mental illness. There's nothing sort of diagnosed there, but there were certainly you know, teenage depressions that occurred. The chapter immediately following that is a letter from my mother in response to that chapter, essentially. And it's difficult for me it's impossible for me to judge my mother's response to me at that age. One, I think there's a whole world of knowledge that I just don't understand, not being a parent. But two, like, it's hard. Like I can see how it'd be tough to try to parent a black boy through that world that she herself did not grow up in. You know, she says she misses the minor signs. I think oftentimes, you know, those minor signs only become clear in retrospect. You know, a lot of that only makes sense when you know the outcome. So, and on top of all of that, I should mention, like, she likely missed many of those signs because I was intentionally concealing them. So it's not like it happened in a vacuum. So that's all to say that I'm incredibly proud of how she reacted to the chapter and you know, the things that she said in hers. I think that was a difficult parenting moment.
And because it was mental, so it wasn't really
Yeah,
physical. It was probably is much easier to hide,
yeah,
because
yeah,
you could turn it off once you entered your house. You didn't actually have
absolutely,
to share any of those, those issues. So
absolutely.
yeah, but and so then I know, but since you did focus on your mom and she was mentioned a lot in the book, I was kind of curious, because I know your dad, your mom and your dad were separated, but you didn't. I was wondering now what he thought about the book. Has he actually? I'm not sure what your relationship, because you didn't talk about,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
has he reached out to you and given you any, context about the book at all?
Yeah, you cut out there for a moment, but I think you mentioned my father, right?
Yeah.
Is the
Yes.
question
Mm-hmm.
about my father?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting question because I am so often asked about how my mother reacted. I'm never asked about how my father
Well, this
reacted.
is Black Men Speak, so
There you
that
go.
there you go.
There you go. I don't know that we've had a full discussion, frankly, about all that was there and all that's not there, all that's not included in the book, which he's obviously attuned to. I think that we have talked briefly about that chapter, bad, bad, not good. My parents were still together during the years that's
Right.
discussed,
Okay.
and for many of them at least, and I think that he felt a degree of guilt, as significant as my mother did. I think it's just difficult to hear that your child went through that. Otherwise, he's expressed only pride in terms of my willingness to get my story out there. And to his credit, has never suggested that it was not my right to tell my story the way I want, even when at times it might not be the most flattering to him. He understands and understood that I needed to be honest to my own truth, and he could share his as well. So I think he's handled it well.
Oh, okay, great. How did you feel about that? That actually, he did express a pride and a
Yeah,
joy that you were able to tell your story and be honest about it.
yeah. I think that when you write something like this, when you write a memoir and you discuss the other, the people that end up being other characters in the protagonist's life, you always end up concerned. I was really nervous putting this thing out there, concerned about what people will think.
Right.
My father was no exception to that. So of course it's a relief when my father or my aunts or all the many family members that I have, like I was concerned that that any of them would feel strongly negatively about what I put there. But again, to all their credits, I mean, like their love and pride was much stronger than any other reaction they had.
Awesome. That's awesome. And that just makes it even more better when your family can get behind, the things that you're doing, especially when your emotions are so exposed and you need that comfort and of your family and friends for that matter to validate what you're doing. So
Absolutely.
So there was another thing I found, fascinating, only because I do relationship coaching. And so
Yes.
you had a chapter about Cameron.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to read some of this and then, kind of get your thoughts. So, it's basically, when is this? Your male counterpart, of course, you'll probably have to get backstory, but your male counterpart fed on their opinions and perpetrated a broken narrative that regarded you as lesser.
Yeah.
I remembered also the sorry souls I had known who stumbled through the pubescent years, drunk on anguish, crushed by fruitless crushes. And then I too know the and this is a little right towards the end. I too know how unworthiness feels. I'm sorry I didn't step in to remind you of your glory. I thought that was powerful. And for a couple of reasons, but I really wanted to get your thoughts on why you felt you needed to put this in the book. Because it basically talks about you were not there. I looked at it, you weren't there for your sister. And so I wanted to get some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, so this is right around the era that we were talking about a second ago when I become Ben's best black friend.
Okay.
And right that same age. And this is a letter to Cameron, who is basically my counterpart in the white girls' school across the street. She's the black girl. And our groups are starting to kind of, come together. And everyone just assumed that Cameron and I would have some, well-fated, destined love story. Right. I mean, it was all about Cole and Cameron. And neither of us we didn't even know each other. Like it was just like, it was so absurd.
That was just the narrative that was created.
Yeah, exactly. The letter that you just read from is essentially an apology letter, because my response in that moment was one of rejection, was to say, I would never kind of thing when with the guys. And I felt I owed her an apology, or I felt an apology should be written down because I didn't know sort of the broader forces at work there. I didn't quite understand what it meant when the black guy in the group is outwardly rejecting the black girl. I did it for no reason other than sort of the pressures that were around me and my own defense mechanisms in that environment, not thinking about her plight and how she had to make her way in that world as well. I felt, this is a slightly broader commentary about the book. I tried at all times to be honest. Like I really wrestled with what was true and tried to get that on paper. And I knew I wanted to deal with relationships between black boys and black girls, black boys and white girls, black girls and white guys. I knew I wanted to deal with that dynamic, and it just didn't feel honest to speak to it without speaking about the times where I had come up short. So that's why it had to come down.
Okay. Yeah. And so then that kind of leads to a segue to a different question, because, I'm a little bit older. And so do you feel, and I know you're not, I don't want you to really represent black men in general, but I just want to get your take just because you're in that generation. But do you feel that black men feel the need to have to stand up for black women, and are they doing that? Or is it in regards to kind of relationships and dating, especially when you're in those spaces that you're, diverse spaces, or is it kind of similar to what you're writing in the book? Men are not standing up as much as they should.
I think that's such a difficult question for me to answer, in part because I am a black man. I think that's probably a question for a black woman. A question of, do you feel supported by black men rather than do I feel as though I'm supporting? Almost to the point that I'm not sure that I have another answer for it. I think that certainly in the conversations I have, many black women will say no. And that hurts. That's because I think that reflects negatively on us as black men. I think that there is a responsibility there for and now I'm only speaking about my own experience, but when I look to my own experience, I look at black women that have been remarkably supportive of me. I grew up in a house with essentially just black women for a time, but beyond them to the many girls, that I have close relationships with, I have always felt supported by black women.
Gotcha.
And for that reason, I think that it's incumbent upon us to return that. And I've tried to, the incident we're talking about in that letter is me at 12, 13 years old. Right. I've tried to grow out of that, and return that support where and when I can.
Yeah. In that 13, that is really difficult. I think a lot of us, if we have lived, grown up and gone to diverse schools, we automatically feel that, because we will get lumped together with the black girl or the few black girls. And so did she? And I know, was this actual letter you wrote to her, or was it just part of the book?
So
and then did you hear from her?
Yeah, so that's an important question. The answer, so Cameron's name is not really Cameron.
Oh, I see.
Well, and I changed the name. I never actually sent her the letter, to be honest, and I've struggled with that in part because, and I stressed this in the letter, like we didn't really know each other, and that hasn't changed.
Wow, okay.
we didn't know each other well at all then. She left school shortly after the time we're talking about. I mean, the end of 7th grade. I'm sure if I did digging on Facebook, I could find her, but it almost felt like, well, this would be a strange thing to do because these were transgressions that happened in private.
Right. Gotcha.
But I, and in some ways I wanted that character to represent something as well that was slightly larger than the individual. That being said, I still wrestle with, frankly, would it have been better to actually send it to her? I haven't received a response. No.
And they were just feelings that you had at the time.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't it wasn't a transgression that you acted upon, or
correct.
You did in
Yeah.
person, and then you needed to officially apologize. And so it's I can see why it wouldn't be something you would need to actually to do later on. So it's all good with that. But kind of then the segue, since we're on the relationships, was the Great Ones chapter.
Yeah.
And so you basically talked about how you're allowed only 3 great women in your lifetime. And so what made you come up with that concept, just for people that haven't heard about the book? And then you add, when you're blessed with a fourth, when you're blessed with a fourth, what will you do to ensure she doesn't get away?
Yeah. So the Great Ones is a chapter that comes right after the letter we just talked about, and it comes from a movie called A Bronx Tale, one of my favorite movies.
Good movie. Great movie.
Yes. And I write about this in the book, and I'm really not overstating it. Like, I really am a big mob movie fan. So I needed something to kind of hold that chapter together, and A Bronx Tale came to mind. And there's a speech from Sonny in A Bronx Tale when he says to Calogero, the main character, you only get 3. She might be a great one. You only get 3 great ones in your life, so you got to go for it. So that felt like good glue to try to tell that story.
Okay.
So I did my best to tell that story. And then you ask about a 4th grade one. She hasn't come along yet. We'll see. But I do think you learn lessons from past relationships that, didn't go exactly as you wanted to. The last one of the 3 great ones that I write about in that chapter, it's clear by the end, as we're coming to a close, that she's much more ready to move on than I am. That taught me a lot about laying it all out there up front, rather than withholding and ultimately ending up feeling as though you lost something. So hopefully I can do that work up front on the next one, if there is one. Because I think I would have, that could have gone better had I done that.
Yeah, and when you wrote about that, I was like, yeah, that's tough, because I think when men get to that point, and then it's like, wait a minute, now you're I'm being rejected. What's going on with that? And so it can be a sense of, you can create a sense of bitterness, but you didn't do that.
No. In fact, I have not necessarily close relationships with all 3, but certainly very positive relationships with all 3 of the people we're talking about. I'm actually probably the closest with the last in the line, which is Anna in the book. Mm-hmm. And no, how could I be bitter? Right. I think that they're all phenomenal people, and she had to do what was best for her. We're still very close.
Right. Okay. Great. And so in the beginning, I talked about tokens. I mentioned the excerpts from the book, and so I'd be interested to know, when you have kids, would you do differently? What would you do differently to ensure that they don't have the same experience? Because part of me, I had some not similar issues, but high school is tough for anybody. I was a transplant from Texas to New Jersey, and oddly enough, New Jersey was much tougher to feel accepted than living in Texas, which I would be surprised at, and probably a lot of people would. But and maybe because it was the times I was in high school, and my wife also had similar challenges. So we made a constant choice. We made a conscious choice to make sure we lived in a diverse neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so I'd be interested to know, and of course we're projecting.
Yes.
Not a parent yet, but would there be some things you would do differently once everything came into place?
I mean, I'm really, nothing immediately comes to mind, and here's why. Like, I don't have any misgivings about my childhood, or the way I was raised. I like where I ended up. I think that it was a long, difficult road at times, but I like how things turned out, and I like what we were talking about earlier in terms of an ability to relate to people of different kind. Different characters with different backgrounds. I think that's something that comes from having spent a lot of time in West Virginia and a lot of time in Ethiopia and a lot of time in Philadelphia in 3 drastically different environments, and understanding at some level that people are people. So I'm proud of the way my parents did it, and in the latter years the way my mother did it. And don't have any misgivings there. Some people often ask, this is not the question you asked, but people will often ask, would you put your kids in a private school, an independent school, and was it worth it, kind of thing? And I think the answer is absolutely. For me, I think every kid is different, but I'm glad. I thought I had a net positive experience coming out of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think even within the stories, you did get the sense that it was positive in nature, and that you enjoyed it. It's just some of the things that happened in your life were worth actually documenting and writing about. And, it might have been just blips on the screen, but the fact that you were able to share it in such detail, which I thought that was what was the beauty of the book, is that the way you wrote about it, because if anyone's even lived in, have gone through those things, even if you were in sports, being the only black man on the team, or, having to deal with, not teammates, but the people you're playing against, you're just playing a game, calling you out your name on the field, which is utterly ridiculous. People, especially black men, could resonate with those sort of things. Right. And so that's what I thought the real beauty of the book was, is that you were able to capture that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I tried hard.
Yeah. And so this past year, 2020, has been a pretty active one and busy one for you. I know you,
absolutely.
People have really enjoyed the book, but so personally, what has this past year taught you?
So this was a unique year for a lot of reasons. Yes, the book came out. I was in Australia for the entire year. And I went to Australia as I think we discussed, to be a consultant, to work for a major consultancy. So I was essentially working, during the day as a consultant, and then working all night on US hours, as an author. Wow. And then doing it again. Add that to the stresses of an election, the stresses of the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that it spiked and why it spiked. I add that, and the coronavirus, obviously, add all of that together. And I persevered through a time of heightened stress, the likes of which I had not faced before in my own life. I think a lot of people can probably say that about 2020. I'm proud of myself for that. I'm proud of myself for like really putting my nose to the grind, or however that saying goes, and pushing through what was a really really difficult period, frankly, personally and professionally. So it has taught me something about my ability to make it through stressful and difficult times. I'm capable of a bit more than I thought I was, and I'm happy to have discovered that.
Oh, that's great. So, yeah, and with the Black Lives Matter movement, you were in Australia. So,
yeah.
So one of the things, was it, since you were in the political commentary, was it hard to be, for lack of a better word, on the sidelines because you were so far away?
Yeah.
And then if not, were there some demonstrations in Australia that you were able to kind of participate in?
So there was a protest in Sydney, which I did participate in. It's so interesting, and I mean, the experience in Australia really spoke to me to how race is just a constructed thing, how it's not universal, how it doesn't necessarily translate across borders. Australia, when you're talking about a Black person in Australia, you're not talking about an African American exclusively. You're primarily talking about an Indigenous person with a drastically different life experience. That's what Black means there. So when we do the Black Lives Matter protest in the middle of Sydney, yes, it has been inspired by George Floyd's death, but it is largely in response to the over-incarceration of Indigenous people in Australia. That is a cultural difference that I think would be lost on many Americans. So it was like, it felt like I was involved. I was certainly talking about these issues a lot. I was writing about these issues in the major newspaper. But it also felt like I was on the sideline because I was so far from the epicenter of my real issue and my real commitment. That was really difficult. I mean, Australia is phenomenally white. Like, it is an incredibly white place. Seldom did I enter rooms if my mother was not there, where I was one of even two Black people. It's difficult to process something like what we saw in the video of George Floyd's murder in total isolation.
Wow.
So that was hard. I mean, there's nothing else to say about that. But writing about it and speaking about it publicly felt at least like I was doing what I could to get involved.
Right. And so you almost, I'm going to say, you were bringing something to light that's not often discussed in Australia. Yeah.
I think there's just not many people to discuss it.
Right.
And what's interesting is that Australia is in many ways American centric in terms of its culture. It really looks to America for a lot of its cultural touch points. So there was people that a lot of Australians wanted to understand it, and just had no one to speak about it, had no one to listen to that was in Australia. So it did at times feel like I was filling a necessary void and trying to speak truth about these issues that matter and they wanted to know about. So it felt like important work, but it was just so far from where the work was really going down, here in New York and in Philly and et cetera.
Right. So yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, because, very rarely we get to talk about, you viewing the Black Lives Matter movement from a different perspective, since you weren't there. Yeah. So thank you for that. It was great. So what's the one thing people would be surprised to learn about you that wasn't in the book?
I worked at Fox News as an intern.
Wow.
Once. People would be surprised to know that I think I've stripped that from my LinkedIn, but you heard it here first.
Oh,
I worked
at
Fox News.
I got an exclusive.
Yes, I worked at Fox News the summer of 2015, I think it was. I was young. They were the only place that would hire me. I thought I wanted to be a journalist, and I was there for a summer. And I was there the summer when there was like 18 Republican candidates. There was the shooting at Mother Bethel AME. There was a jailbreak in New York that almost everyone has forgotten about. I mean, it was just a crazy summer. It was like the best experience that I would never repeat again. It was an incredibly toxic place, but it taught me a lot about the world I wanted to ultimately enter.
Wow. What did you learn?
One, just like journalistic stuff. Like I learned how to write on
Okay.
a deadline. I learned how to, how to follow the news and what to track and how to speak about politics. And so that was helpful. But also there's something about, I mean, like, I don't think it's healthy, the place that we've gotten into in terms of our discourse, where one side can't even like acknowledge that there might be any legitimacy in the other side. I've always tried to at least have dialogue, and it was valuable to be across what felt like enemy lines to see how that place operated. Like I said, I thought it was valuable to see it because I knew that I didn't want it.
Gotcha.
But valuable nonetheless.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting because it was almost like you were in enemy territory and getting this valuable information about how they actually operate. So, so I always like to end the show. Well, thank you for all that you've done, but I always like to end the show because we always have things around our mind and thoughts that we may not necessarily share about what's either going on right now or maybe a couple days ago. But what is on your mind right now as an African American man?
I think that's an interesting question. There's a lot of things that are on my mind as just an American. I'm not sure how many of these are filtered through the lens of my race, but I've just gotten back to New York after missing the last year, and I've landed in a drastically different place than I left a year ago. And it's almost haunting, like it's eerie to move around this city and see mostly the shadows of what I once knew. So many of the places that I loved have closed permanently. So many of the people that I love have left. Obviously, many people, if I don't know directly, certainly in my broader universe, have passed from a pandemic that I never saw in Australia. Like it just never hit for Australia. So I'm wrestling with, I think, the last few days and probably will continue to, just how to move in this space that feels unfamiliar all of a sudden. That's really been on my mind lately.
And do you feel confined, being the way the city is going, confined to just move around and
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, for just to give a sense of the scale of the difference, like I went almost all of 2020, I think, without putting a mask on. Like there was no COVID in Australia. like
that's amazing.
When I left Sydney, it had gone 30 full days without a single case in the whole city. So coming here, I mean, it's drastically different here. And I feel confined, but I also just feel like I don't know the rules anymore. There's a sense that like I got in the airport and there was a prevailing sense that like everybody could be a threat. like you don't get too close to everybody else because everybody is a potential threat. And that sense of guardedness, I think, is going to take a while for me to grow into.
Yeah, it can be really dehumanizing, and we are very kind of immune to it now because we've been here, and you're just kind of, it's almost like you're vaulting into a new universe.
Right.
And so
exactly.
they have the rules and to deal with that. And it's just interesting because, of course, I was watching the Australian Open and I had heard that. Yeah. And so basically they probably had to put these rules in place just for everyone else that was coming to the tournament.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, fascinating. So, Cole, I just want to thank you for spending an hour with me. And, of course, the book was great. I'd love to before we go, Linda, know what's actually next. What's going on?
Yes. So I'm working on actually 2 other books right now. And I'm hoping that there's some stuff for the screen coming down the pipeline as well. Can't say too much about everything yet, but I will be able to soon. And if people follow me at Cole TD Brown, then I'll stay up to date. Hopefully there's a couple exciting announcements soon. I guess the other thing to mention is that the book was nominated for an Image Award, an NAACP Image Award.
Oh, that's great.
For debut author. So I'm eagerly looking forward to that ceremony at the end of March as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. So do you consider yourself now a writer, or just a man that just wrote a wonderful book?
We were talking about that earlier. I think you got to prove that the first wasn't a fluke. There's a lot of things that I would change about that book. Even today, I am proud ultimately of what I was able to put on paper, but I think you got to do it twice before you can walk around calling yourself a writer. So I'm working on that. I'm working on the latter.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, and I don't want to, well, what would be one thing you would change about the book?
The book, we talked about this, that the book was written over 4 years and I had to learn how to write. As a result, there was like tens of thousands of words that were written in 2016 for a book that was published in 2020. And I felt, particularly towards the end, I felt shackled to a lot of that language because I no longer sounded that way. So as a result, I think if you read the book, it almost sounds like a different author as you're moving through it. And that's in part because it was, I had changed significantly. A lot of that older language, I think I would go back and change if I could. But I ultimately decided to leave it in part because it had been 4 years and I needed to get this thing off, but in part because I think I wanted to show that progression over time. As I mature in the book, I'm also maturing as a writer writing the book.
Exactly. And yeah, I was going to say that's what makes it great, because it does show that your mindset changed from when you were that seventh grader, seventh grader, to then how you were as an adult. And you, of course, have different feelings, and that was reflected in the end. So I think kudos to you for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just hold on a bit, but we'll sign off and we'll see you in a few.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't read the book, pick up Greyboy, Finding Blackness in a White World. The book is fascinating. You will laugh. You will cry, and you will feel part of that book, because I know I did. And I come from a different world, but it's just the fact that as a black man, you can really, you go through these things in life, and to be able to put it in such a way, such a humanized, emotional way. He did a great job, and just support the brother, because our brothers out there need support, and they need, he's gotten it, but hey, any more support is just as helpful. So I thank you for tonight. It was fantastic. Remember, you can follow Black Men Speak podcasts, past shows on live stream on Libsyn, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And also of note that we will be moving. We also now have YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, and I will post that later on. And so, follow that if you like, if you don't like Facebook. And we'll look forward to the show coming up in a couple weeks. So you guys have a great day, and peace.